too. It's like stories from our own family, etc. So Diana has a good one about her father, and all of us have a lot to share. I will be sharing the story of Clark Olson, one of our former ministers, that I was going to share in the sermon. We'll have a story for the children. We might sing a little. We'll see as the Spirit moves us this morning. And John Preziosi said wisely, he had one announcement. If you're not here yet, don't come. So let me turn it over to Tim. Why don't we start with the story, and then the children who want can go back upstairs. And yeah, I am. And you'll see the visuals behind you.
Okay, so our story today is by Julius Lester. Let's talk about race. I am a story. So are you. So is everyone. My story begins the same way yours does. I was born on, take me for example. I was born on January 27, 1939, in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm kind of old, huh? How does your story begin? Many people and many events are part of my story, and yours too. The names of our parents and where they were born, whether or not we have brothers or sisters. I had a brother who was 9 years older than me, but he was dead. What kind of work our parents do or did? My father was a minister. My mother was a housewife. My story and yours have many elements, such as favorite food. Mine is fish. Hobbies. I like to do crossword puzzles, take photographs, and cook. Favorite color. Red, or maybe green, violet, orange, and purple too. I think my favorite color is olive. Religion? I'm Jewish. Nationality? I'm from the United States. Favorite time of day? Night. Oh, there's something else that is part of my story. It's part of yours too. That's what race we are. I'm black. What race are you? Just as I am a story, and you are a story, and countries tell stories about themselves, race is a story too. Whether you're black like me, or Asian, Hispanic, or white, each race has a story about itself. And that story is almost always the same. My race is better than your race. Some stories are true, some are not. Those who say, my race is better than your race, are telling a story that is not true. Why would some people say their race is better than another? Because they feel bad about themselves. Because they feel that they are afraid. Because. But there are other ways all of us, even me, even you, think we are better than others. I'm better than you because I live in a. I'm better than you because I go to school. I'm better than you because I'm a boy. I'm better than you because I'm a girl. I'm better than you because my dad or mom makes more money than your dad or mom. I'm better than you because I'm white. I'm better than you because I'm black. I'm better than you because I'm Hispanic. I'm better than you because I'm Asian. None of these stories are true, are they? I want to tell a true story, but I need your help. So here's what I want you to do. Take your fingers and press them softly against your skin right below your eyes. Be careful, don't poke yourself. All right, now press gently until you feel a hard bone right beneath the surface. Now if your mom, dad, brother, sister, or a friend is close by, ask them if you can touch them. If they say okay, take your fingers and press softly at the same place beneath their eyes. Press gently until you feel the hard bones right beneath the skin. Thanks, Rats. All right, now press someplace else on your body, on your arm, chest, or head. Press anywhere until you feel the hard bones beneath your skin. Beneath everyone's skin are the same hard bones. If you were to go outside without your skin on and without your hair on your head, the next page, turn the page and see what you would look like. All right. But you want to know something? If I went outside without my skin, my mustache, and the hair on my head, what little I have left, I would be just like you. And you would be just like me. Suppose, just suppose, one day we, and I mean everyone in the whole world, decided to take off all our clothes and all our skin and all our hair. Then we would do what we normally do every day. Go to school, go to work, play, and shop. Everything would be normal, except we would look at each other and couldn't tell who was a man, who was a woman, who was white or black or Hispanic or Asian. Which story shall we believe? The one that says my race is better than yours? Or the one we just discovered for ourselves? Beneath our skin, I look like you and you look like me. She looks like her and him, and he looks like him and her, and we look like them and they look like us. When I look at you, which story do I see? Do I see only the color of your skin, the shape of your eyes, the texture of your hair? Do I look at you and think I know your story when I don't even know your name? Or do I look at you and wonder, what's your name? When were you born? Where were you born? Where do you live? What do you like? What don't you like? Gee, maybe we like and dislike some of the same things. Your race is not all that you are. My race is not all that I am. Yes, I am black, but I'm also a man. I am of medium height. I have a deep voice and a loud laugh. I love to laugh. Do you? I live in a big house in the woods in a small town. I like pancakes and macaroni and cheese and I am so many things beside my race. To know my story, you have to put together everything I am. Like I bet you didn't know I have asthma. Beneath the skin, we all look alike, you and me.
So why don't we, sorry, surprise you from the left over there.
It's a voice from above.
So I see that Jim has just arrived. So good to see you, Jim.
I skated up the my car's down at the bottom.
And I was thinking, let's sing a song together. Not all the songs, but one of the songs that was really an anthem of the civil rights movement in many ways. That you may remember, that some of you may remember the Nina Simone version, I Wish I Knew How. Let's sing that as the...
Okay, I actually have some offertory music for us to do.
Oh, you do?
I do, but we're going to sing together.
That'd be so...
It's all part of the fun.
You're singing some offertory music to sing to. And we're not following the order of service, Joe.
Okay.
Just so you know, just in
All right, well
case.
then we'll just have a fun song.
Okay, well then let's do that fun
Okay.
song.
And this is perfect because it's in two parts. And let's see. This side is going to start. Oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints go marching in. Well, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching. Familiar, right? Try it again. Oh, when the saints, 3 times. Oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints go marching in. Well, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. Now, you're going to sing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, you know that right? Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I'm going to put it together you first. Oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints go marching. someday know when the gates are open wide. I'll be standing by your side. I want to sing, I want to dance. Someday know. One more time. I want to sing, sing, sing. I want to dance. I want to sing, I want to dance. Someday know when the gates are open wide. I want to sing, I want to dance.
And so, since that was our offertory, Jim, and since we have board members certainly in the room, we'll put a basket out in the back, and if you feel moved to give something on your way out, of course, that is gratefully received, and as you know, it makes a very big difference. And how glad I am that we didn't wind up putting a dedicated collection on today. Because that would have been unfortunate for a nonprofit in the area. So the children can go upstairs and play, the ones who want to. And just so you know what we'll be doing down here, I'm going to share some words from a Ware lecture from Dr. King in 1966, and we'll have a discussion about race matters this year.
Wait there.
And these floors, I appreciate Eduardo more and more as a parent of a young child because his lips land on every square inch of ground in this building.
Worship is the grand war.
So, Dr. King was a Ware lecturer in 1966, and what the Ware lecture is actually at our annual General Assembly. It is sort of a big thought lecture of the year for Unitarian Universalists. And this year we're actually going to have Cornell West is going to give the Ware lecture. Those of you who are deciding about General Assembly, these are things that will be happening. And there's been Mary Oliver. I mean, there's been many, many people over the years. It's quite a distinguished list of speakers. So the whole, I want to commend this to you, the whole Ware lecture is actually online, so you can read this. If you go 1966 Ware lecture, Martin Luther King, you'll pop it up. But I want to read just an excerpt that I think has been speaking to me, really all of it speaks to me, but this year in light of everything going on around our country. The thrust of this sermon is about how to remain awake during the revolution, but the part I'm reading takes up a slightly different piece. So, there we go. A second myth that we must deal with is that of exaggerated progress. Certainly we have made progress in race relations, and I think we can all glory that things are better today than they were 10 years ago or even 3 years ago. We should be proud of the steps we've made to rid our nation of this great evil of racial segregation and discrimination. On the other hand, we must realize that the plant of freedom is only a bud and not yet a flower. The Negro is freer in 1966, but he is not yet free. The Negro knows more dignity today than he has known in any period of his history in this country, but he is not yet equal. There still are stubborn, difficult problems to deal with all over the country. I am appalled that some people feel that the civil rights struggle is over because we have a 1964 civil rights bill with 10 titles and a voting rights bill. Over and over again, people ask, what else do you want? They feel that everything is all right. Well, let them look around at our big cities. I can mention one where we're working now, not to say that it's the worst city in the United States, but just to reveal the problem that we face. Take a city like Chicago. It's a prototype for all our major urban ghettos. There we find that 90% of the Negro children of Chicago are in school with 92% children of their own race, which means that the schools are almost 100% segregated. Facilities are inadequate in all of the ghetto schools, and I'm not going to give you all the statistics, but he talks about education, he talks about unemployment rates, and he talks very strongly about the importance of housing and about discrimination in housing and about really segregation in housing. So let me just skip to here, but I want to read this one line. If the whole of Chicago confronted an unemployment what the Negro is confronting, there would be a staggering depression, worse than any country has ever, this country has ever known. Here. These are stubborn, difficult problems, and yet they are problems that must be tackled, for I need not remind you of the dangers inherent therein. There is nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a large segment of individuals within that society who feel that they have no stake in it, who feel that they have nothing to lose. These are the people who will riot. These are people who will turn their ears from pleas for nonviolence. For the health of our nation, these problems must be solved. In the areas of housing, schooling, and employment, there is still a great deal that must be done. We've come a long, long way. We still have a long, long way to go, and action programs are necessary. I've heard it said that the day of demonstrations is over. This is something that we hear a great deal. Well, I'm sorry that I can't agree with that. I wish that I could say the day of demonstrations is over, but as long as these problems are with us, it will be necessary to demonstrate in order to call attention to them. I'm not saying that a demonstration is going to solve the problem of poverty, the problem of housing, the problems that we face in the schools. It's going to take something much more than a demonstration. But at least the demonstration calls attention to it. At least the demonstration creates a kind of constructive crisis that causes the community to see the problem and causes a community to begin moving forward toward the point of acting on it. The church must support this kind of demonstration. As the days unfold, I'm sure that we will need more. And I'll just say that I think we're living in a time, and I wrote that in my sermon, of exaggerated progress in terms of racial discrimination. And I think what we're witnessing is a time where we're seeing pockets of change and revolution happening right now in demonstrations, and then how will this affect meaningful legislative changes? And I think many of you may remember from your reading in the news or my preaching or your own journaling at home that the Voting Rights Act has been really eroded in the last several years. So many of the things that were fought for are actually moving backwards. That line where he talks about things definitely being better off 10 years later than, and especially 3 years ago, I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm confident things are worse than they were 3 years ago, for sure. So anyway, we'll talk more, and I do encourage you to read the whole thing when you have a chance. But let's sort of digest the words we just heard, and now let us sing that I Wish I Knew How. And it really was kind of an anthem of the civil rights movement. I think the last song we chose for today, We Shall Overcome, is certainly well known, but I think younger folks may not have actually heard this, and some people certainly know it's a civil rights movement. So it's 1:51, and I encourage you to rise. We always sound better when we have more breath. deal with the story I'm going to share about James Reed's death. And how many of you haven't heard of James Reed or known about his story? Yeah. So I haven't gotten to see Selma yet. We're hoping to see it this week. So I'm going to tell the story and Clark Olson, our former minister's story. And I'm really curious to hear how, this is directly from someone who's there, how does the movie portray it? And actually, did they mention James Reed was Unitarian Universalist?
No.
They call it
They just said he was from Boston. No. They said a Unitarian pastor.
They did.
They did.
I was just
They said
curious.
Unitarian. It wasn't mentioned before.
The civil rights era so dramatically shaped and reshaped our movement. A telegram came from Dr. King. I'm not going to, as I said, read the whole sermon, but I do want to share this story. It's the 50th anniversary. It feels appropriate. So here was the telegram that reached the Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters from Dr. King. And can everyone hear? Okay, good. In the vicious maltreatment of defenseless citizens of Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed at random, we have witnessed an eruption of the disease of racism, which seeks to destroy all of America. No American is without responsibility. All are involved in the sorrow that rises from Selma to contaminate every crevice of our national life. The people of Selma will struggle on for the soul of the nation, but it is fitting that all America help to bear the burden. I call, therefore, on clergy of all faiths, representative of every part of the country, to join me for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday morning, March 9th, the next day. In this way, all America will testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy everywhere in our land. So our former minister, Clark Olson, was interested in going, and he didn't have the funds to go, but he was serving a congregation in Berkeley, California, and a couple called and wound up leaving a message for him that they were willing to pay for him to go. And so he did get on a plane the next day. The three ministers that were involved were their lives and really the story of the civil rights movement intersected in a powerful way. Alison Miller, who worked at the association in the office for really what we would call campus ministry today, and James Reed, who didn't just, and I wrote this in here, that it was interesting in many ways that he was the one that was killed and martyred because, much like Dr. King, in his own way, this wasn't his first day of sacrifice. He was so deeply committed to the issues that were impacting the Black community in his time that he actually left the parish ministry, devoted his work entirely to community ministry. And that community ministry was so powerful that he was even considered, while he worked in Boston, an associate minister in Washington, D.C., All Souls Church, which was one of our congregations at the time, predominantly Black congregation. And he moved his 5 children and his wife, and they moved and lived in Roxbury in a section of Boston that was filled with a lot of the kinds of issues that Dr. King raises in his Ware lecture. And so he had been sacrificing all the time in moving the agenda of Black liberation forward and service. And service. And certainly Dr. King's life was one of service. So it's interesting, and I think Clark, obviously his heart is in the right place, and Alison Miller as well, but James Reed really did live this. And so I bet they didn't tell that part of the story. So Clark, James, and Alison Miller were having dinner that evening. Clark arrived in the afternoon at, I believe it's called the Walker's Cafe. And interestingly enough, they were having conversations. Clark, very progressive, was talking about organizing a trip to Russia. And talking about wanting to do that. And actually, the FBI has all kinds of work on Clark Olson, not only because of the civil rights, but because he was involved in exchanges there, and so they were hurling many accusations about him. Unfortunately, after dinner, when they left the cafe, the three men were walking side by side, and 4 or 5 local white bigots basically came out from behind and attacked them. And imagine the courage, just before I give the details of that, imagine the courage. They all had small children at home, all their families, and Viola Luzo, who's not part of this story, a mother. Their families begged them not to go, basically, but they just felt called, really, to be there. And so the 4 or 5 white locals started yelling, "Hey, you niggers," and they sped up, but they ran after them, and one of them had a huge club, or maybe a pipe, and knocked James Reed, like, with such a sound. Clark talks about the sound of that hitting his head. And Clark tried to run away. He hadn't arrived in time for the training. Orloff Miller drops to the ground and covers his head. Clark tries to, step back and gets punched in the face, drops to the ground, obviously because of that. And then the 3 men endure incredible blows. And for me, some of the stuff that we're seeing, and I know more so for those of you that may have, been alive or closer to the history, the images of the police now is just so reminiscent of the violence that, and I talk about this in the sermon, and I'm going to get there in a minute, mostly African Americans endured. And a tragic part of the story is that it is true that it took the death of a white man to captivate the attention of Congress and the president. But that's part of the story. It saddens me that it wasn't the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which is actually the reason that they were called down in the first place. And as they were kicking the men, they yelled, "You want to know what it's like to be a nigger around here?" And finally, the attackers fled. James Reed was really not in good condition, but he was able to talk. So Clark and Orloff realized they needed to get him to a hospital. Welcome. Hi. We're just having a discussion. Oh, we were out there. And Clark talked about really how frightening it was, because they went to a clinic in Selma, but it was very clear that they weren't going to get fair treatment there. So they couldn't stay there because James wasn't going to get the treatment he needed in order to survive. On the other hand, a blow to the head, it's not a good idea not to get treatment right away. So they got in an ambulance and went from the clinic in Selma, where they initially were, to Birmingham. And they were being chased on the ambulance by additional, supposedly white racists who were knocking on the ambulance. And Clark really talks about how frightened they were for their life as they were, with any of them being dead. And unfortunately, well, they did make it to Birmingham, but unfortunately not in time. And James Reed wound up dying from wounds, I think, a couple of days later on March 11th. And that was what precipitated, I think, Lyndon Johnson. And actually, Martin Luther King spoke at James Reed's memorial service. And really, it was so dramatic. There were 710 Unitarian Universalist ministers around the country at the time. About 300 of them came. So a huge number. And a huge number of lay people. Viola Luzo, who was killed ferrying people during the march, was a laywoman who came and just felt called. So it wasn't just ministers. There was just, in huge numbers, in proportion to our religion, people showed up. And of course, not just Unitarian Universalists. I mean, it was Jews, Catholics, Protestants, just everybody really embodying some of our cherished values. And this is how President Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Bill on March 15th. And there's this sort of fortune and I think sadness in this. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. So I'm going to sort of turn it over now, but when I hear those words, it also breaks my heart, because it wasn't just one good man. It was countless good men and women who were killed, and I have in here some honoring to the countless Black lives that really, and lifting up some stories that were killed beforehand. But it doesn't diminish the sacrifice that James Reed made, and obviously that's a part of our history, so it's important to tell. And obviously, we're most conscious about all of the sacrifices that Martin Luther King made. And I commend to you a book called The Radical King and King Legacy. Cornell West did an introduction to it. It's just out this January, and it takes King's writings, some of his very, he was probably at about 80% popularity when he delivered the I Have a Dream speech. He was probably at about 40% popularity when he was killed. Because, to shift now a little towards the events of today, he wasn't just interested in a Black man in the White House. He wasn't interested in the power entering into the hands of a few. He was very interested in looking at the plight of poor people in general, and I think he would have had so much to say at how disproportionately policies are affecting African Americans in our community today, and I think he would have been very outspoken about that, mass incarceration, etc. But let me just open it up at this point to hear reflections from those of you that saw the movie Selma, those of you that may be making connections between what's going on in our country, anything that you feel moved to talk about. Yes, David.
I was here when Clark was minister. We were almost married by Clark, except he was on sabbatical. You mentioned Moscow. His first wife was actually a girl from Russia. And he's still doing fine. We keep in touch with him.
Yeah.
I remember him telling a story about he was like, oh, there's some dialogue getting into the FBI, and he contacted like, hey, can I get a copy of that? And like, well, you know, it's like 5 cents a page after 500 pages.
Yes.
I think one thing that's important to realize is that when King's popularity started plummeting, it was when he started speaking out about opposing the Vietnam War and opposing poverty and opposing racism altogether.
Right.
And his speech, Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam,
Right. At Riverside.
is an extremely powerful speech where he ties the war and racism and poverty all into one thing.
He had a real global perspective on racism in a way that I don't think anyone really followed for decades. And now people talk about what he was talking about. Yeah, I think that's
I was born in '59, so I was moderately aware of the civil rights movement, the war, the Moon Walk, and so on. But one of my strongest memories of my mother is, sorry, I knew I was triggered, so she threw herself on the bed and just had a kicking, screaming, great fist-beating tantrum. And I didn't understand, 7 years old, why my mother was doing that. And that was the day that he got shot. And so, that was one of those little crystals that I began building my world around, just understand things.
racist South, I lived some of the South stuff. And I can tell stories all day, which don't work that long, about, experiences with racism. And I was just thinking through some of the things, a lot of them involved my dad, who was extremely racist. And it makes me realize, if I told a lot of stories, he would just sound like this horrible little demon. And he was tough in many ways. Not just racism. There were other ways that he was a tough dad and a tough person. But then he also had very good sides. And I think it's so easy to totally demonize those racists who you might see depicted in the movie Selma. And I think as with everything, it's so important to draw a distinction between demonizing the behavior and demonizing the person. And even though there are certain behaviors that you can't excuse and you shouldn't excuse, and I don't excuse a lot of things that my dad did, but yet knowing him, I know that there was a lot of good, and he did a lot of good things in the community and so forth. It's very complex, something like racism and so many things. Like we had a black maid who lived in Maid half the week, who we just loved, and going to bed at night, I would go over and kiss Mom and kiss Dad, and then I would go over and kiss Betty good night. I was probably 3 or 4 or something. That's just, you kiss the adults good night. And I remember my dad having this very serious talk with me about how we all loved Betty, and she was a wonderful person. He, in his own way, he treated her very well, but that I was not to kiss her. We didn't do that. And I remember I just didn't understand. It didn't even occur to me. And for years, that was this big mystery why I wasn't allowed to do that. And many other things, meeting a college friend who was black to go to a concert, and I had to drive down to the bottom of the driveway and meet him there. He wasn't allowed to come on the property. And here we had a black person living there half the week, but it's okay because she was a maid, and this guy was not. And it just so many, an accident, witnessing an accident that where some black people were involved and the truck turned over. And I don't think anybody was seriously hurt, but, one of the men was like rubbing his head where he hit his head with the black men, and the young white guys in my group were laughing at that. Oh, that was really funny. And just so many stories. So it affects us, and affected us all, and it reminds me how complex it is and how easy it is to fall into some of the very simplistic, one-sided thinking that spawned racism and our response to racism. And I think that King had a knack for really not doing that. He had talent for that. We need to keep learning on.
There's a really powerful passage where he writes about the story of after his house was, of his house being firebombed. And once he knew that his wife and young daughter were okay, he talks about his feeling sorry for the leadership in the town. I think it was a mayor and somebody else. And on one hand, they deserve the blame because they had sort of incited the riot, and then on the other, on the anger of the people in the town. And then on the other hand, he writes about how he feels sorry for them, that they're a product of their culture and a product of their time, and that they're essentially, he says, good men. It was interesting, and I think sometimes many of us, he's been critiqued because of his nonviolent stance or because of his love, but there was this love of humanity in this just powerful way, but not ever a condoning of the behavior at all. But your story reminds me a little bit of it. I have this on just because I'm nervous about accidents and such. But this doesn't
We witnessed a man went into a telephone pole down the street.
Oh, I know what this is. This is Corinne. This is Corinne. Do you want to check outside and see?
I can still see ice on the trees.
Yeah.
I would hang around for a while, not rush off home.
You can call, what you can do, you can call this number and tell her to call her. She's the 413. It's 30, so it's not good yet.
The ground is cold.
And so I think this point is really important because it's so easy to get into that black and white thinking and that one-dimensional thinking. And you get angry about that happening. But to realize the nuance and to realize that these people living very complex lives, and most importantly, they had been, if you will, indoctrinated for generation upon generation, especially the whites in the South. I grew up in Arkansas. And yeah, and my grandmother on one side was very racist. I mean, I was telling Alex yesterday some of the comments that she made that were shocking to me because my mother and father, who both had been raised in Arkansas, just weren't racist. And it just was such a dichotomy. My parents did a very, very subtle protest. So subtle that I think most people didn't catch on. But does anybody remember those older of us, the TV story, the TV show Julia about the nurse? Diane Carroll, wasn't it?
Oh yeah.
And so they made a Barbie doll of her, a black Barbie doll. And I loved it. And my mom bought me this black Barbie doll. And I would carry it around the town, this southern, very white town that didn't have a single black person. And I think that, to a certain extent, I think that was her way of letting me, normalize and not make a big deal about it. And I love it. I love the TV show. But also just to kind of make a message in town.
And the humanization thing is so important. I'm just so struck in my head right now. I have running through that song about until, and it's also connected to James Reed, but until the killing of black boys, black mother sons is as important as the killing of white boys, white mother sons. And when you share the story of the Barbie doll, it's that idea of how it is possible that we perpetually dehumanize groups of people in the face of he talks a lot about science in the Rowe lecture, every evidence to the contrary. And just, I can't imagine the soul, the depth of soul that he could continually remain committed to the idea that that you just could never ever get to justice by unjust means, and the commitment that he had to nonviolence in the face of all of that dehumanization, that he didn't become. And in the writings in that book, you'll see he does wrestle with it, but that he managed to just stay on that side is just so powerful. Anyone else wanted to share? Yeah.
When I was familiar with the gentleman from Boston, I forget his name already, but the whole story.
James Reed.
And when you see him come out to the movie, I said, oh, that's him. And they showed in the march, and there's highlights of it, and the brutality of his beating and all that shit. So it's kind of disturbing, but in a way, I think I expressed to you previously how I don't like separating injustice. But when he's beaten and killed, it almost like, oh, that was me. That's a Unitarian there. And it in a way shamed me a little bit because the whole time period was tragic. But still I separated it. So I come, here's the Unitarian guy. And I kind of lost the black persons or the struggle that they were in daily, not just that one day. It was very, very important.
It is interesting. There's a big, that deal, and I think he was that's what I was looking up before. Martin Luther King was so in touch with the daily struggle. I think he would have celebrated, and obviously to have Obama be president is the realization of a lot of the work that he was fighting for. But under his tenure to have so many, the Voting Rights Act be attacked and also, again, I think mass incarceration really is connected because that was, so much of it has been effectively repealed because if you're a felon, you can't vote, and the disproportionate policing practices that happen in every state practically in the union, that the war on drugs has really functioned. I'm really wrestling with this because I think on one hand, we don't want to advocate drugs, right? I mean, I think we need to have a dual conversation about our healthcare system and about rehabilitation and the seriousness of addiction and that whole underground economy. But it is just amazing how you read, I was reading Cornel West's writings, like you just don't want it to be true, that 4 out of 5 Black youth can expect to be arrested at some point. It's just stunning. And you know it's because of disproportionate policing policies. And then all of the things that get attached to that, that if you're arrested for marijuana, and if you're arrested at the level of a felony, did you know that you can't get food stamps after that? Yeah. And then right housing, there's so many things.
And they don't, if you're no longer part of the without work statistic. Once you are a felon, that you're not part of that statistic of unemployed. So when they say, oh, so many people are unemployed, well, they're not counting all the people who are felons.
And they can't vote.
And they can't vote.
And actually he does write about that. I mean, I thought that was a poignant line where he talks about if you lift out the statistics of unemployment or these different things for what African Americans were facing then, that America would be suffering the greatest depression it had ever known. And I think to take those statistics out now, especially looking at where he was at the end on, right, the poor people's campaign, looking at the statistics of certain segments of the African American population, I think we would find a very similar thing. And of course, it's even more complex now because it's not as black and white, quote unquote, as the narrative was in the 60s. It's much more complex in terms of how we treat immigrants and all of these things. So,
The complexity of the time, it's very interesting how Martin Luther King was a politician in his own way. And the dynamics of Wallace, Eisenhower, and King, and why he picked
You mean
Selma. Johnson, I'm sorry. Why he picked Selma. And where there was a hothead sheriff. And, Johnson was egging him on in some respects because this is where there's going to be a scene. And then there's finally the white population or the voting population gets involved. And now it's a crisis in the White House. And, they portray that. And then towards the end, this is all history. I'm not giving you any either way. They're in the White House, and he says, well, in 1985, 20 years from now, he's talking to Wallace, he says, I don't want to be on your side of history. And it was, what you want to be remembered for. And then that's why, but it was very political, even this is what we want. We want a hothead because we tried it in New York, and they treated us with respect. They took us away on carts and, peacefully took us away. We were peaceful. We want to, we needed publicity. We need, something dynamic. And it was a peaceful man, but he knew the politics of the time.
well, he had certainly a strategist
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear about politics because I think he was politic, but on the other hand, he was never willing to compromise his values to a certain point.
Yeah, they show
And
that
so he
very
talks
clearly.
about, do they? Because
Yeah.
he talks about, in his words, he talks about how politicians, even black politicians that are beginning to ascend, how they may get certain grants they're looking for, or get opportunities, but they're not going to contribute to
it is
the story.
portrayed.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
I wanted to say a couple of things about the strategy. I love the history that's there. If you read about, say, why Brown v. Board, came to an end. It wasn't by just chance. There were a lot of smart men, Marshall and others, that said, this is the one. They turned down a lot of others.
Yeah.
And the same thing with King. This is where we need to march, because we tried it other ways. And we're smart about, setting up the pivot point for history. And,
It wasn't spontaneous.
yeah, no.
It was like,
It was good
I
strategy.
thought it was
There's a lot of
that way.
chess, a lot of really
Yeah,
bad
very
people
chess game.
trying to push things along. And I want to give deference to, some of our current politicians and just say, no, they really aren't evil. It's just, it's the way that things are going, whether it be, the Voting Rights Act being slowly eroded and gerrymandering districts and, lack of access and whatever. Sometimes I think that, no, it is a bit of a regression into tribalism, our tribe, and protecting what we have. And that maybe my naivete that all good people, these are just the natural meanderings of the culture as it tries to find its own democracy, maybe aren't as warranted. And maybe you do need to look at it in light of that there are people that are pushing buttons to try and protect interests. But we get into the thing. And one thing that I think is also good is that we see the erosion of the Voting Rights Act. Recently, there's been a movement to not allow employers to ask whether you've been arrested. And I think that's a big help in order to get over those, some of those hurdles that, in an unbalanced policing system has created an imbalance of young black men with felony records.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before, but I'm in an interesting position with my marriage that, maybe is an advantage or maybe it's a disadvantage that I do get called out on occasion for little things that happen. And this is my husband's research, as many of you know, he does mass incarceration and whatnot. But, as he is a Latino and our children are, a little bit of both and have yet to figure out exactly their own identity, sometimes we have discussions about these big, mass incarceration and imprisonment, but we also have to deal with the little things that make those big things institutionalized. Like going back to Michigan this past summer and my grandmother, who claims not to be a racist, and these are things that my husband will call me out on. It says, "Oh, your babies, they're so beautiful. Look at how dark their hair is and how dark their eyes are." Do you really have to make a comment like that? Yes, the rest of my family is blonde and blue-eyed, but these are the little things that I think lead up to the institutionalization of things. And for the vast majority of folks of color, they have to do both. It's hard enough to deal with the institutionalization, but then you also have to deal with little things too. And I give them kudos because it's hard.
Reading if you're not said Martin Luther King did that speech, you identify the data.
Yeah.
So, that's what's going on. Recently, you saw the statistic that 50% of the children in public schools are in poverty. Most of those public schools are in the cities. And there's that. Over 50%. And mostly black children of color. And again, you look at extended it, the Islamic community is now categorized also. And civil rights are going to go out the window for them too. It goes back to fear. And we said tribalism. All that, and I think to you, on individual levels, we need to, every time, confront it with compassion and understanding. Like Jim was saying about his father. Not a bad guy, but that's how he was raised. There's a book here in the library by Tim Weiss called White Racism. If you have a chance to read it, it's fantastic because we're all racist. That's not the record. We're all racist. We see somebody and we see color. Okay? It's because it's so much part of the culture. He talks about his grandmother was the most pro-civil rights person. Was out there and influenced how he was. But when she was getting in her senility years, I'd say, and this nurse of color to get away from me later.
Wow.
And he said, why? So we really have to look at ourselves, compassionately, but also just step up whenever we can.
And actually, actually, I think what you just said especially, because I think what is it that allows the plight of groups of people to be totally invisible? And it's our complacency. And it's about the importance of being, you know, another way, you were talking about how on some level all of us can be racist. It also, to me, means that all of us have to proactively be anti-racist. In other words, what does it look like to make a specific effort on a daily basis, or at least a periodic basis, to say, let me look at what I'm doing and how culture has formed me, and how can I intentionally, I have to intentionally. He talks about, there's a quote here that I lifted up in the sermon about essentially that non-cooperation with evil is just as important as cooperation with the good, is how he put it. And it's so interesting, like the laws that we have today around terrorism, you brought up Islam, for example. He talking in this, I think it was in this lecture, in one of his writings, about how his relationship with Mandela, that would have, would have been, he would have gone to jail for that. I mean, that it would have been considered to be an ally to terrorism, essentially. So that gives you pause. That the laws today, well, it must have been of him, but probably was Cornel West speaking about him, which is that the laws today would have put him in jeopardy because of that. Wow, that does give me a pause. And how even just that knowledge starts to shift my thinking, and how can I constantly put these materials in my way that nuance these ideas. Because of course there's not one response to this. There was a whole thing in the news too around, some of you may have caught it, around how African American academics disagree with each other about different things, or about Obama's presidency, or about that. And I just, even when you're reading it, it's a little bit like your point about your children, the small things. It's like, oh really? I mean, white academics disagree all the time too. So why is it so shocking that, but so how can we bump up against different and diverse ideas that are written by people who look like us and don't look like us, so that our thought is shaped by more than just the people that are around us?
I think King's nonviolent movement reflects certainly our principle of the inherent dignity of every person, and that he often talked about having compassion for his oppressors, and the thing that I think he was looking at was, it's not the people that are the problem, it's the systems that are the problem. And I think about it reflecting to today, that where our economy and our nation is going, where we see that more and more disenfranchisement of the middle and lower middle class whites as well, is starting to brew up a lot of division, and it's the systems that are creating this. Even looking at an individual police officer that shoots a black child, is it that officer, or how could all of these incredibly horrible things be done by police officers? Well, it's not the people that are going in there, it's the system of the police itself that is breeding and continuing this cycle of racism and fear and hatred. And that's, we have to pay attention.
Well, and even the militarization of the police and all the equipment they even have, it's like, guns don't kill people, people without weapons don't kill people, people with weapons. And if you have a semi-automatic, there's like an assumption you may be using it. So he talks, but yeah, absolutely. His nonviolence too is so powerful, and I think he talks a lot, was so inspired by Gandhi, and that is what happened with the deaths of Jimmy Lee Jackson and James Reeb and Viola Russo collectively, was that to some degree, the fact that they were nonviolent in the face, and of course Dr. King, willing to really put their lives on the line, did transform their suffering into a hunger for freedom amongst the whole country. And so exactly what he was preaching about and exactly what he was hoping for, not necessarily to be killed, but for suffering to be transformative in that way. But it's just so hard. I mean, I see it and I think, I feel for these parents whose children or their spouses or whoever's been killed, and they make a plea for nonviolence, and I'm just so impressed with their courage. And then I feel such compassion for the person who, the rioter, who just like maybe that's the other side, maybe like the parent that you were describing, who was racist, who was born in a certain time and of a certain circumstance. You know, he, through serious spiritual discipline, was able to get there. And I worry that the new racist rhetoric, in some ways, that it's somehow now inherent, an inherent tendency to riot, rather than recognizing the circumstances of poor people, right? I mean, I think it's about really recognizing ourselves in, if any of us were born under different circumstances, we don't know exactly what we would rise to or what we wouldn't rise to before we did rise to. I mean, it's really...
One thing I just would love to bring forward is the tribal nature of what you were speaking of. And if you think about what's happening out there right now and how many people mobilized in France,
Yes.
while at the same time Boko Haram was annihilating a huge population, and there's no, so I
All
just,
the world leaders didn't go to
nothing,
Nigeria.
right, and it just, that's what really gets to me, the tribal nature of who people will get on Facebook and rant about, whether it's something going on in Israel or France, and yet at the same time, horrific things are happening, and why aren't we collectively angry about all of it? Why are we choosing those things? It just...
White privilege is so endemic throughout the world.
Yeah.
I think, though, I agree with what you were saying about, systemic issues and cultural things that can really manifest as racism. But I think we have to embrace as human beings that there is a part of the human psyche, whatever it is, perhaps just a fear of the unknown, which can be manifested in many different ways. One being racism, that we all, there's something inbred in humanity that from which racism can grow. In high school, I visited a friend whose family had a chicken farm, and she took me into this football field-sized building full of thousands of little yellow chicks that time of year, I guess. And I noticed that a fair number of them had a lot of brown on them, and I'd never seen that. And I commented, I said, I never knew that. I thought they were all yellow. I never knew that some of them were brown. She says, oh, they won't live long. They get pecked to death by the other ones.
Wow.
And I remember thinking about that because they see, the vast majority see that some of them are different, and whether it's an instinctive, this could be a disease that I might catch or whatever it is, they peck those to death because they're different. Otherwise, they're just as healthy, or
Just like middle school.
Just like people. I remember thinking that people were like that. And even in 1981, we think of racism as being, and this movie Selma, focuses on the racist South and the Southern thing, or American thing versus other countries. It's not. In 1981, like 20 years after Selma, I moved to Astoria, Queens, and a friend gave me a lead on an affordable, nice apartment in a nice neighborhood. I moved there. And after moving there, I realized here in New York City, and I thought, I'm in New York City now, no racism, no this, no that, and the other. Not one black person anywhere. And this was a population the size of a small city. Not one on the street, not one in the neighborhood, no black people. And I started noticing that and asking, I understand if this were like a really, really wealthy, it wasn't. It was a sort of little, kind of middle class, maybe a little tiny bit upper. And at that time, it was largely populated by recent immigrants, German, Italian, Polish, Greek, many of whom moved here after Martin Luther King and the big civil rights stuff, and who had not grown up in their countries with these issues. And these people were extremely racist, and I discovered an incredible network between realtors, property owners, and landlords. And it was very subtle. There was no way to prove it. You couldn't go to court and prove this. But the proof was in the pudding. Here was an affordable neighborhood in New York City in the 1980s that did not have one single black person to probably 300,000 people. And that just didn't happen by accident.
You know,
Still
this-
exists in North Jersey.
Well, I think
So there we go. There's something to human spirit we have to embrace and
It is,
call out.
but I also, which I totally agree, and I think that sometimes, though, I will say this, that, again, I return to that proactive thing, because I also think that there's research that if children, like young children, come to know maybe good news, right? Come to know great diversity early on, like if there's, maybe a literal uncle, maybe just a metaphorical uncle, somebody who's close in the family, that they come to trust what they see. And that part of the problem is that if you only see the same thing, then that's what you trust. And that if that narrative is interrupted, then as you age, you don't grow up necessarily with that narrative. Now, society has it, so that has an impact. But that gives me hope, too, that if you are in a different context where maybe that's not totally natural, then you can work to break that narrative. And I think for us as a congregation, because I do want to think about that too, is that how can we break that tribalism narrative? Like how can we come into contact with people who think like us, don't think like us, look like us, don't look like us? And how can we also become a place that's more conscious of the barriers for people who might arrive here because they are X, Y, or Z, and we just haven't seen the barrier yet. So those are some of the things I think about. And I want to mention that we are going to be doing a book discussion of Michelle Alexander's Jim Crow on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Tuesday in Love Month, February. So any of you who are interested, I encourage you to get a copy of that book, and we'll meet at 7 o'clock and have discussions about it. I think it's important. And the UU Legislative Ministry is going to be very active around, being active around mass incarceration. And actually just recently, the executive director was wondering about the legalize drugs, decriminalize. She's curious to know where are our people? Where are the Unitarian Universalists on this issue, and how does it connect to racism, and what are the stands that we want to be taking? So there's some really rich, I think, moral opportunities for us to be involved in the coming days. I'm looking at the time. And does anyone else have anything burning they want to say? And people can continue informally. I just don't want to kind of capture you.
Follow up on this. I think there is a truth to there being a human nature element, but I think that it's also important to try to learn about that element, and I don't think there are parts of ourselves that are necessarily evil. So there are very good reasons to classify people. I work at an extremely diverse university, and I classify the students readily, and then I try to maintain a discipline of staying flexible within that. But if I'm talking to a group of Muslim students, I might not use an alcohol reference to talk about fermentation in the same way. Or if I see the body language that indicates that there's a group that has a religious opposition to evolution, I actually have things I say that kind of tease that out. I can see the body language shift. So I actively categorize people, and then the discipline is how do you turn that to good? How do you keep from trapping people in those categories? But you've got to start, these categories are your shortcuts before you really think, that allow you to respond quickly. And that there's evidence, research that's shown that African Americans will associate a black face with negative aspects, that they've got the priming too. We all receive this priming, and it's a part of our nature. And then the challenge is to become aware of that. And I'm often confronting that. Our fundamentalist friends with certain mannerisms, it bugs me, and I have to stop and think, don't let that happen. I think we all, I'm not sure it's entirely instructive to call it racism. Just call it whatever the nice form of your inherent bigotry is.
And some of them could be positive, like another nice, there's a hand right here, and it could be celebrating diversity. It could be that someone becomes very learned about diverse traditions and is ready to be a translator and is not necessarily judging negatively. And so I think that there is a both and an and to these things. You had a hand.
Yeah, I just was thinking about that as soon as the story happened this morning, because I think that story was wonderful for a first introduction to racism and the problem of racism for a child. But it strikes me that actually forgive me if I'm not expressing this well, but it seems like we actually have to ask people to see skin color and not just to try to see underneath as if we're all made of bones.
Actually, I told Tim, you may have noticed, those of you who are astute, not to read the last page. It said something like, will you look under my skin? It was like, because it was like referencing the bones, and it felt too far to me to eliminate. So
well,
that's interesting.
I grew up in Wyoming, which is very conservative, and I didn't see overt racism like you described, Jim. But what I did see and experience was a kind of cavalier attitude that the solution to racism is just to say, oh, I'm colorblind.
Right, and that's not helpful.
And so actually we have to ask people, I think, to start by actually seeing the fact that you're an African American and your skin color is different, that you have a different story, and that you and a whole community of people have arrived where you are because of that.
Yeah.
And just to say, well, I don't see skin color, actually is very offensive to a degree. And
It's part of being respectful of people's, differences. It kind of comes back to a lot of this stuff that's been going on, like the whole Charlie Hebdo thing. As a nation, France and people all over the world stood up and said that they don't accept that sort of violence. But at the same time, some of the stuff that magazine puts in there is overtly just bigoted and racist. And just stomach-turningly nasty. And we have to treat everybody with respect, and their differences need to be acknowledged and recognized. And if you're a Muslim and you're a conservative Muslim, those things are offensive to you. And you should be offended. And
if you don't see race, how can you see racism?
If I put myself in the position of, say, my parents, who maybe are ignorant about some of these statistics and some of these Cornel West speeches and things like that, they have no idea about that. And I think it's a little confusing to say, we don't want you to be racist, but we do want you to see race, but not in a bad way. I think it's a little bit mixed up, and I would like to see some clarity of thinking on that topic.
You know what you remind me of, which is this. You just brought up a really good place for us to end, which is that, not end then, but no, but really, because some of the anti-racism stuff in that the Unitarian Universalist Association and the ministers have been acquainted with has shifted over time. So it used to be that you would have this one narrative, right? And that, to some degree, personal power plus prejudice power plus personal prejudice equals racism, as a systemic racism, for example. But it's much more complicated because it turns out later thinking, today's thinking, more multicultural thinking is that people don't necessarily need the same thing. So what this person needs to shift their thinking along a continuum of I want to say, deepening understanding is not the same as what this person needs. It's not the same as what this person needs. And let me explain. And I've seen this a lot, let's say, in some Unitarian, certainly liberal white. There's a whole thing about becoming white, losing the culture, all that stuff. And so one thing that'll happen is that somebody will say that culture is worse, that, rap music or that, whatever the music is, it's not good music, judgmental, overtly racist because they're targeting particular things. But then there's someone who moves away from that, understanding that it is beautiful, and then sometimes people go through my stuff is actually white culture is all bad, like we have nothing good, So those two people, depending upon where they are in the system, they need different things. So it actually turns out that there are some people who need to come to understand that we're all the same underneath our skin. And then there are other people who maybe understand that. They need to understand and see that actually there are real differences, cultural, some that we want to celebrate, some that we want to understand, and that unless we really see those differences, change can't happen. And we certainly can't live in a multicultural society that we want to lift up if we're saying we're all the same, So I'm so glad you brought that up because I think it may be, according to some of the later thinking, confusing to give someone the narrative about race if what the thing they need to learn right now is to be colorblind. And I think sometimes it can be a clash of the generations too, because generations have needed different messages to kind of progress collectively as well. So for me, the colorblind message feels dated. But in the 1960s, it was really important. I mean, my mother, when she visited, and the South you're right, there's so much racism in the North, but these stories wind up coming from the South sometimes. When she visited Georgia for the first time in the 50s, as a Jewish woman, when someone found out she was Jewish, somebody checked her for horns. That person needs to understand that Jews were human beings. Do you know what I mean? So that's really, I think it's a complicated answer to your thing, but it turns out that we actually need. And so what they advise now is that you can't take a whole congregation through the same experience. You have to offer different experiences and help people find the experience they need now in order to become more anti-racist, more multicultural, more loving, in a foundational kind of way. So that's interesting.
Come down to the inherent worth and dignity of all people.
It does.
When you really see that as a fundamental value, that it becomes a lens that you can see any culture and any person, but still honoring their humanity as a case of
It does seem like that makes sense. It really does. Well, let's close by saying, sure. It is, and actually, I want to thank David. He's out of the room, but David drew this for today, and fewer people saw it today, so I figured I would.
169 in the gray book. 169, a big anthem of those marches, many of those early marches, we shall overcome.
We shall overcome.
the two of you have. And there are 1 or 2 extras, is that right? There are 2 extras, so that if somebody wants them, Cory Booker is going to be the breakfast speaker tomorrow morning. And the cost is $25. And I'm not suggesting that it's safe to leave. And
Still
people,
20 degrees, so I wouldn't recommend leaving.
so I'm just saying that I just felt like we should have a more, and this was an informal service, we should have an even more informal discussion at this point. So, but I do hope people will consider coming to the book discussion about the new Jim Crow and In an Age of Colorblindness is what it references. And I do hope that some of you may feel moved to be dialogue and reflection partners in how we as a congregation and as individuals can move forward in the ways that we can.
Are we going to do the general service and something?
I was going to run out and sort of see where we are and have that discussion. Did you talk already?
Coffee and
Yeah.
and snacks, so please.
Yeah, let's go in there.
Do you want the chairs back?
I would, because I think we may want to leave it like this in case.
For next
Bush
11
comes
minutes.
in. And I'm not saying you have to stay, and that's fine. You can take next. But you have to
I really love the phrase you use.